Hi everyone and welcome. Today we have with us Subhashish Bhadra, who recently released his book Caged Tiger, How Too Much Government is Holding Indians Back. To give a quick introduction about Subhashish, I know he has already done it. He is an economist by training, like many in the room. Having worked closely in the policy world and in the corporate world, he has had several interactions with bureaucrats, academics, and entrepreneurs, and his book is a culmination of it all. His book touches upon India's most intricate and serious problems, and he looks at it from the perspective of our democratic institutions, why India is how it is today, and what is the role of institutions in issues with respect to regulatory governance, tech policy, and digital rights. Today, he has promised us that he will touch upon the details in a more academic detail than what is in the book. I guess. Okay, so over to the author. You can just.
Great. It's a pleasure to be speaking here for many reasons, but primarily among the fact that in many ways, kind of the intellectual origin of this work is in the exposure that I had to Ajay and his team at NIPFP. And for me in 2016, walking into public policy, I thought that was for me, a very refreshing frame to think about a lot of the challenges we see at that point. You're working in tech policy, but to think about regulatory governance as a new lens to think about how do we solve some of these problems while everyone else was focusing on what should be the solution. I think what NIPFP and Ajay's team there were thinking about what is the path through which we arrive at the solution. And I think that was a very refreshing lens for me. And at some point in about 2020 or so, 2019, 2020, that winter, where I think there was a lot of political emotionality in the country, if I would put it like that. I think a lot of people are waking up to participating, young people are waking up to participating in politics for the first time by showing up at protests, by talking about these things, feeling the emotion of the moment. And I think it also led in many cases to a certain amount of friction that people had within their families, within their friend circle, etc. And that's when I thought that this lens that I had been exposed to for all this while, can we really bring that lens into these kind of conversations, that perhaps there's something that we don't agree about certain aspects of our politics, but can we start building a narrative, reaching across the aisle, having conversations on something that we can all agree on in a what one might call an apolitical way, for lack of a better word, but that's what Caged Tiger is all about. Caged Tiger is about, can we look at some of India's most intractable issues and talk about the processes that get us there rather than the outcomes themselves. And in the next few, I'll probably try to take about 25 to 30 minutes on the presentation and then open up for questions, or please feel free to shoot questions anyway. What I'll try to talk through is what kind of framework that I've come up with. I'm trying to apply that in different sectors. What you will see is that very often there are, just because it's a popular non-fiction book which is meant for a mainstream audience, you will see certain leaps of faith. I would invite you to explore and criticize some of those leaps of faith as we go forward. So let me stop all of that and get into the context and content of this presentation itself. While thinking about the challenges of India, one of the first hypotheses or assertions I make in the book is that despite all the differences between these people on this slide and people who kind of either support or really dislike them, I think there's a great amount of continuity in the way that the Indian state operates. Of course, one might say that people are like apples and oranges, but I think if you look at all the things listed in the center, there is a certain amount of convergence that we've always seen in the Indian state. Someone I spoke to a long time back, a colleague of mine from the US, once came here and said, look, out here there's no question of left or right. Everyone's left. You're just different shades of left. And therefore, state welfareism has always been a key part, even when, for example, someone like Modi comes in and is seen as a right-wing leader, talks about minimum government, etc., but he also goes down that path of welfareism, possibly of a slightly different kind. Everywhere from Nehru's point around the non-aligned movement to Modi's refusal to criticize Russia or take a very clear stance on it and working with both sides is basically a call to a multipolar world order. As much as we criticize the censorship that we're currently seeing in ways around us, Let's be clear that the first kind of book that was censored was in Nehru's time. It was also a book that was criticized for having an alternate interpretation of the Ramayana, so it was also of that nature. Misuse of governors' offices, hot topic these days, but again, if you look back at it, it was a persistent issue in all of their tenures. And finally, while you might say economically India has moved a lot, but it's broadly still stuck to the mainstream discourse of that time. In the 70s, socialism was in vogue, and India was aligned to that mainstream. And even now, with more open markets, etc., India tends to be aligned there. So I'm not trying to take away from the differences among these people. There are plenty of differences in their policies, plenty of differences in the way they ran the country or are running the country. But I think there is a thread of commonality that is going through all of it. And therefore, the question I ask myself is, what is that thread of commonality, and how do we start deriving what that means? So here's again, I remember many conversations with Ajay in the tech policy space where people who talk about how bad Facebook is and all of that, and Ajay always reminded us that, guys, you're forgetting the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the government. There is a reason that we guys need to think of government very, very differently. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here. But I think this visualization of government that Thomas Hobbes did in his book Leviathan is super useful, which is to say that, and again, I draw the link between this and the classical economics 101, where it says, hey, government has to intervene when there's market failure. And I think apart from market failure, there's societal failures, right? In the absence of government, there are certain informal institutions that hold society together to a certain scale, but beyond the point, informal institutions don't scale, which means that there's war, there's widespread chaos, etc. And Thomas Hobbes, who was writing this in the middle of the English Civil War, thought of the Leviathan as made up of, so if you look in detail, you see these are people here. So Leviathan is this big monster made up of people who in a way are the subjects, and the head is the king's head. And very similar to that, we have the government, wherein we all are its constituents. The head is the government or government itself. And each of these constituents gives up a certain amount of rights in order to get the safety and security that a government provides. We have to care about the government because therefore in doing so, we make the government the exclusive monopolist of violence. That violence obviously is physical violence, that it is the only one who can put you in jail. Facebook cannot put you in jail, but also economic violence. It's the only one that can force you to pay taxes. Others can't at least force you that coercively. So this is the reason we have to talk about this, and the fundamental trade-off that any country or any society makes is how much of that liberty do you give up for the safety and security that government provides. And that's where I think each Leviathan that every country sets up is unique. And my hypothesis and my assertion is that it is very largely driven by the circumstances of that country's birth. So if you take the US, for example, it was essentially born as an anti-tax regime. Like there was a lot of taxation that the British government was doing in the US. The people who had settled there did not want to do that. So it is a country whose entire institutional architecture is based on a skepticism of centralized power. Because of which the implication that I've listed some of them here, A is they've set it up in a way that doesn't centralize power. There's a checks and balances model there. Congress or the legislature is independently set up from the executive. Since the 1970s, for only 1/3 of the time have they been captured by the same party, which means there's that robust checks and balances between these various arms of government. Secondly, it is a rigid constitution. It is a constitution that essentially did not which believed in the kind of institutional architecture it had set up and was not open to a lot of tinkering around that, did not wanted to make almost somewhat an absolute document. So their constitution in about 230 years has been amended only 27 times. India has been in for around, our constitution has been around for 75 odd years, has already been amended over 100 times. And finally, and this is the point when I sent early drafts to Ajay, he'd also pointed out that as much as you might call the US president the most powerful man or someday hopefully woman on earth, it is an extremely weak position. You cannot set your own budgets, you cannot go to war, you cannot even select your cabinet colleagues without the Senate's approval, which often is from the opposition party. So that was the context of the US's birth, and which kind of then permeates into a lot of the institutional architecture that they've set up, which is bound a lot more by relatively rigid rules. It's far more decentralized, etc. India, meantime, and what I call the three original sins of the Indian state, sins in today's context. But at that point, those were possibly the right things to do to many reasonable people. We were coming off a long period of economic stagnation. Between 1914 and 1947, the Indian economy declined and contracted by 11%. And that wasn't a worldwide phenomenon. At that point, Europe was growing. European countries had grown by 33% in that same period. So India had stagnated economically. That stagnation in India was especially perverse because it was leading to starvation deaths. There's estimates that about 60 million Indians perished due to starvation during British time. So again, put yourself in the shoes of our constitution makers at that point. With that kind of economic stagnation, starvation, etc., they looked at the state as as an economic power, as an economic liberator, which is why they said, let us take it upon ourselves to try to solve some of these problems. Similarly, caste discrimination, of course, we are intimately familiar with it, but one statistic that really stands out for me was in the entire Constituent Assembly, the number of Dalit women was 1. Now, this is a group that probably at that point also represented at least 6 to 7%, if not more, of the population, and you're represented by one person. Economic inequality was rife at that point as well. So, therefore, as Pratap Bhanu Mehta says, that at that point, what our founders were thinking about, they were more afraid of social oppression than they were of tyranny. Which is why the way they designed fundamental rights was in a way that doesn't stand in the way of using the state as a reformative agent in the economy. Which means that unlike in the US, where it's the Bill of Rights, there's largely no ifs or buts, and there's a judiciary which has largely stuck to that line. In India, I think we have, if not weakened, at least contextualized fundamental rights a lot more. As K.M. Munshi said when he was a part of the Constituent Assembly, that these fundamental rights are written from the point of view of a constable, because it allows the state to intervene in many different ways, and it's not this absolutist document. And at that point, one might argue this was needed. Again, Gautam Bhatia argues in his book, The Transformative Constitution, that we looked at our constitution as a way to reform society, and therefore you couldn't let fundamental rights stand in the way. So that's another important decision that our constitution writers made. And finally, the kind of trauma and chaos of partition, I don't need to necessarily go into that. But what that led to was that there was a walk back in the promises of federalism that had been made during the independence movement. In fact, one of the only major decisions that was reversed by the Constituent Assembly after agreeing to it was to have a popularly elected governor at the state level. And then it was done away with to have our current system, which we've seen how has been rife to misuse. But that was part of that centralizing tendency. And increasingly, we also see in the fiscal space, like now a lot of the tax collection happens at the central level and is then devolved into the states. That these are all choices that our constitution makers made for the context of that time, but which now I would argue in the context of today's times are not really holding us very well. That said, we also operate in an environment where the Indian government is highly trusted. And these are against some of the statistics and some of the examples here are things that Devesh Kapoor calls out. But at the end of the day, let's not take away from the massive achievements of the Indian state. We have run the world's largest elections multiple times. There have been peaceful transfers of power, which we now know is not something we can assume. There has been great physical safety. The homicide rates, even from 1990, has fallen from 5.2 per 100,000 to about 3.1. Polio eradication, smallpox eradication, consistent economic growth since the 1980s, controlled for our income level, India has very high electricity penetration. But that's not the experience we have as everyday Indians. As everyday Indians, about 39% of us have paid a bribe. About 35% of our young children are stunted. Pollution is leading to lower life expectancy. There's some estimates which say there's about a death every 3 minutes because of pollution in Indian cities. So the everyday experiences of being Indian are very different from these kind of grand narratives of nation building. And therefore the question I pose to myself is, how do we get better at this everyday aspects of governance, the things that really affect everyone day in, day out? And that's where I come up with saying that what we really need to think about is not so much what are the rules you frame, but how do you frame that rules? Who's in the room? How is participation happening, etc. And I drew again inspiration from one of the papers which was inspired by the work that was done for FSLRC, where they'd identified a number of principles of good regulators and good regulatory institutions. And again, I understand regulators are a very specific kind of public institution. So this is the biggest leap of faith that I have made in the book in terms of which one might criticize for not being intellectually on the soundest grounds. But be that as it may, from all the principles of good regulators that we've listed, I came up with 3 principles of what I would call good institutions. Try to come with something that is abstract enough that it applies to many contexts, but at the same time specific enough that it tells us what to do. Fairly simple things like a tightly written law. Starting with, there should be a law. A lot of the things we do in India's state intervention are not backed by a law of parliament, which creates a lot of challenges, as I'll show in some of the examples. But once that law is written, it should also be specific. It should call out who can do what are the repercussions, what are the processes through which they come up with things. And many people will argue that a parent legislation cannot have too much specificity of detail, and that's correct because legislations stay for much longer times. But does the legislation specify what is the process through which we come to those answers is the question that I take up. The second principle of good institution is you can have the best law in the world, but unless you know how it is faring, it's extremely difficult for you to understand, is this a good institution, bad institution, are we doing well, are we doing poorly? So transparent adherence to that law becomes the second principle. The third principle is independent oversight, that even if you have all the data out there, if no one can take that data to question you, it's kind of pointless. So these are the three principles of good institutions. Again, reminder, this is a leap of faith, but we start applying that leap of faith to specific case studies. The first one, which for all the economists in the room will be quite understandable, is around the public distribution system. Again, we see a colonial era program. This is something that was started during the wartime, done away with for a few years and then reintroduced. Today, we have a network of 500,000 fair price shops. So this is an expansive system which spends hundreds of thousands of crores every year as essentially to run this program. So it's extremely large part of what we do as a country. But when we start applying that lens and the three principles of good institutions, we see a couple of things. I think as far as a tightly written law is concerned, there are certain things that the NFSA does do well. A, the very fact that it exists in law. There are not too many of the government subsidy programs which are actually based in solid law. So the fact that it does that is commendable, though belated, happened in 2013. There's a lot of good things to like in the law about the level of guardrails that are put around delegated decisions. So, for example, prices at which grains are sold is a delegated decision. The law calls out that these are the prices to start with, and the prices then have to be matched with how changes in MSP happen. How were the grains distributed between states is also something that this law provides guidance on. Directly or indirectly, we also have a lot of clarity on how this scheme is performing, because NSSO brings out data that then is open to researchers can go through it, etc. People might again doubt the quality, frequency, accuracy of some of these surveys, but I think there are enough both public and private surveys which help us to get a sense of how the PDS system is doing. But where the PDS breaks down in particular is around independent oversight. If you look at who monitors the performance of the PDS, these are food commissioners that are appointed by state governments. Food commissions are appointed primarily at the beck and call of the state government, so there's no independence there. They can be removed at any time. So everything you see in what makes a body independent is something we don't see in the Food Commission, and there's lots of states which haven't even appointed them either fully or partially. Given that this is a body which is essentially adjudicating on issues, you would assume that there would be members from a judicial background on it, and in most food state commissions, we do not see people from a judicial background. So this is obviously not exhaustive list of both pros and cons in the PDS system, but just trying to say how this framework starts applying to some of these areas that we look at. And throughout the book, I've also peppered this with the larger question. So this is this kind of specifics of it. The larger question is, should the government even intervene in food consumption, and how should it be doing so? There is evidence and there's research which says that because of the design of the PDS, there's an overconsumption of rice and sugar by Indian citizens, and that leads to either no impact on overall well-being or negative impact on certain parameters such as stunting. I haven't covered Manrega in these set of slides, but if you look at Manrega, there has been evidence that in the initial part when Manrega was rolled out in a phased-wise manner, people looked at the differences in school enrollment between those different phases and found that Manrega leads to increase in school dropout, especially at the higher classes. And as a country, we might argue that's okay, that's a cost that we're willing to pay, but I don't think we are yet at that sophistication of public policy discourse where we're asking those questions. So the book also contains a lot more discussion on this larger question of whether there should be government influence on food prices and consumption, but I'm going to sidestep that in the interest of time. Similarly, staying in the economic realm, we talk about fertilizer subsidy. Again, we see a colonial program. So this was as part of the Defense of India Act during the war period, then brought in as the Essential Commodities Act by the government. Control orders can be issued, which is the government says, okay, I'm now issuing a control order that the price of such and such commodity can be such and such rupees. But the grounds on which these control orders can be placed or issued are in favor of the general public or for the defense of India. And that's where I say tightly written laws start breaking down, because they're extremely vague terms. You will see in subsequent example of things like public order. These have never been defined very tightly in either legislation, or even the jurisprudence on that is fairly mixed. So that's where we see a lot of the common trends across different sectors, including more recently in kind of internet regulation, that we've seen these kind of phrases of public order, public emergency, etc., are ripe for misuse. And then high discretionary power with central and state governments. They can bring out these control orders primarily at any point. There was something that positive that happened, which was in 2020, the government brought in rules that these kind of intervention in food markets can only happen when the price increases beyond a certain percentage of the long-term average. So there's some, again, the discretionary power is guardrailed, but we see that only for food prices, and it's not true for some of the other controls that the government brings in. I want to talk about the independent oversight here and then the larger question, because I think it's really pertinent in this case. But one, we again see a common trend across all our institutions is of liberal use of incarceration. So if you're violating this, you can be put in jail. And I remember the first few drafts that we had of, some of the middle drafts that we had of the data protection bill also had provisions for incarceration. And I think the liberal use of incarceration, including as criminal defamation, as we are all now seeing, leads to many challenges, which I think as a society we need to reflect on. And then because these are administrative decisions, the judiciary is typically not an oversight here. If someone says, I'm going to fix the price of fertilizer at 500 rupees, no one's going to court and saying it's 450. The court is not even going to entertain those kind of arguments. So I think the independent oversight also breaks down here. And finally, the larger question of should government be intervening in setting the prices? Because I think especially all of us who've studied economics would know that once you start setting prices, there are all these second and third order consequences which you don't really think through. Most of the government subsidy, 64% of it goes into urea, which means that our Indian farmers are using more urea than they should. The typical ratio that you would have between nitrogen and phosphorus is 4:1. In Indian farms, it is closer to some 16, 17:1, which means a lot more nitrogen goes into the air through water. It kind of percolates down into the soil, and in Punjab is leading to the syndrome of blue babies. That entire chain of thought and the implications aren't always clear, which is why the argument of this book is keep your interventions as government minimized, because you never know what the second and third order consequences of your interventions are. Telephonic interception, again, those of you who would have worked on surveillance, etc., would be fairly familiar to you, which is, again, lawful basis is a very old colonial law. Grounds for legal interception, very vaguely worded, public safety, public emergency, etc. A 1997 Supreme Court judgment did put some guardrails around it, but as we look at the independent oversight section here, because there is no transparency, in 2019, the government blocked an RTI request, which even asks the number of these cases that are being looked at by the oversight committee, and it didn't ask for specific detail, it was yet blocked. So you don't know how many of these requests are being raised. You don't know, is the oversight committee even looking at it? They are supposedly meet once in 2 months. Nobody really knows. In 2015 alone, there were about 5,000 such requests by the Union Home Ministry itself. Now think of 5,000 requests over 2 months, 10,000 requests done by a committee of people who are already extremely busy and none of whom have a judicial background. You can imagine what, I actually can't even imagine what's happening with these meetings. And then of course, no court warrant. So it's not like the court is overseeing this before the interception happens. After interception happens, you've seen cases of the courts coming down saying it was illegal, destroy the records, etc. But very often damage in that case is already done. Sedition, I think enough people have spoken about it, so I'm going to sidestep this altogether. And we look for conversion for marriage, or not even for marriage, right? But conversion in general. There are laws that are passed by 12 states at this point in time. Again, uses these kind of vague terms around coercion and all the grounds on which religious conversions are not allowed. But here's the very interesting thing in these set of laws is they really flip the principles of natural justice. So the principles of natural justice would say that till you are convicted, you are innocent, whereas in 7 out of these 12 laws, it is incumbent on the accused to prove their innocence. So you're guilty unless you prove yourself innocent. the requirement of transparency of governments, instead of government having to be transparent, it is the individual who needs to be transparent. And in 10 out of these 12 states, you are required to give, once you're planning to convert, required to give a notice to the district magistrate that you're planning to convert. In some cases, there'll be a call for objections. In some cases, the police is supposed to do an inquiry. And overall, just a far more difficult process. And I think there's, again, we are now seeing more and more states start implementing that, and I think they are in that sense borrowing from some of the worst institutional design that we have seen, starting with, in this case, 67 when Orissa brought in the law, but 68 when Madhya Pradesh brought in the kind of the public informing the district magistrate, etc. So though that kind of institutional erosion stays with us, what Madhya Pradesh did in 1968 is similar provisions that Uttar Pradesh did more recently. So that's it. So in some ways, I've said these are the three common trends that we need to look for in the kind of good institutions we have. But at the same time, these institutions are also obviously changing. And the reason I think this becomes important is if you look at the interwar period, and this is something that is covered in great detail in the book, The Narrow Corridor. But you look at how the Scandinavian countries were placed at that point and how Germany was placed at that point in the interwar period, right at the beginning of the Depression. Fairly similar paths, fairly similar starting points. But the way institutions, both political parties as well as formal institutions of governance, dealt with that situation in the Scandinavian countries, which is by forming alliances, by bringing workers and industrialists together, etc., led to a certain path which then resulted in this upward spiral, which results in the Scandinavia that we see today. And in Germany, which soon became Nazi Germany, we saw a far more confrontational form of institutional engagement, where institutions were almost at war with each other, and at least power centers were at war with each other, and then that descended into the path that we all know. So in this chapter, which is the penultimate chapter of the book, I talk about what are the ways in which our institutions are being shaped right now, and what do we need to watch out for in terms of how it evolves. So three things. Firstly, spread of technology, the obvious one, which is it strengthens our institutions because flow of news is much faster. 82% of the people now read their news online rather than in print. Individuals have become news creators, so 50% of people have actually posted news or reposted news. Political mobilization is much easier now. You can just WhatsApp people saying, hey, we are holding a protest there. Command and control doesn't work anymore. So while Indira Gandhi could have pulled the plug on the electricity plug on the printing presses when they declared the emergency, that's going to be far more difficult to do now. You'll have to pull the plug on the entire internet, which cost-wise is far higher. At the same time, spread of technology is weakening our institutions because while command and control doesn't work, the state is basically giving its oversight powers and accountability to a whole bunch of loosely defined entities. One is setting up a lot of regulatory institutions, etc., which are now using the coercive powers of the state, but more importantly in terms of volunteer groups. We've already seen it in China, where citizens are asked to basically spy on other citizens, and we're starting to see that in India as well, where there have been news reports that there'll be online monitoring of the chatter, etc., to identify radicalization, not by state actors, but by these loosely defined group of volunteers. Disinformation campaigns, 3/4 of the countries are known to have structured, have procured kind of or services of people who kind of spread disinformation, cyber troops, etc. So spread of technology, again, on one hand benefiting, on one hand weakening our institutions. Secondly, unlike the early 50s when one Congress party which was extremely dominant, today's government, even with the large brute majority that the BJP currently has to interact with a whole bunch of other powerful stakeholders. There are state governments, powerful state governments and powerful chief ministers. There are mega MNCs who basically vote with their wallets, so you don't want their flight of capital to happen out of the country. There are other governments. So there's a lot more interplay between power centers that typically happens now and which shapes the quality of our institutions. But as we again see in the case of Nazi Germany, that kind of conflict between power centers, while it is good because it enables the creation of a broader consensus, can also lead to a lot of conflict. And when this conflict happens, then these institutions start becoming exclusionary. So at some point, for example, we say as a country that, hey, look, we are very pissed off with the kind of foreign interference of foreign governments' roles in our country. We start making our institutions a lot more insular. And that's one of the reactions that one can have to this. And secondly, in the world around us, authoritarianism is on the rise. So which means that we can also form coalitions not just with more liberal countries, but also more authoritarian countries, right? So this interplay between power centers also is an overhang over our institutional quality. And finally, which I think deserves a lot more attention, is around political polarization. In the book Why Democracies Die, there are two things that are called out as the soft guardrails of democracy. One is that you do not demonize the other side, that you still consider them kind of patriotic and good citizens. In the US, we've seen this completely come off the rails. Very large percentage, I don't remember the exact metric, but I believe some 30 to 50% of each side views the other side as a mortal danger to the country. And even in India, we're seeing elements of that with all colorful words like Bhakt and Liptad and all of that, right? So our discourse is becoming more and more polarized, where it's not a disagreements in ideas, but it's almost ad hominem attack on the other side. The second was in terms, the second soft guardrail of democracy in terms of not using all the powers that you have at your disposal to weaken the other side. And again, we see that in the US in the form of them using, especially in the Senate, not letting legislation pass. So the rates at which legislations have passed has fallen very, very significantly from the 1950s. There's very little bipartisanship. Even the most bipartisan of, for example, Republican senators only votes 10% of the times with the Democrats. So we've seen that there. And in India, I think more recently, we are starting to see the use of pocket vetoes and every kind of the fringes of our constitutional architecture. So we recently saw that case where the Supreme Court had to pull back its recommendation for the appointment of a judge to the Madras High Court. And I think we will likely see that kind of soft guardrails come off. And if you come to think of it, and this is something that I believe Babu Jagjeevan Ram had said back in the day, that if you come to think of the architecture of the Indian Constitution, the president actually has quite a bit of power. The president could literally refuse to sign any of the bills that the government sends to him or her, and only needs support of 1/3 of the MPs to not be fired or not be impeached. So which means with the support of 1/3 of the MPs, the president could throw our entire constitutional architecture into chaos. It doesn't happen, and that's what's allowed our democracy to continue. But as we see more and more polarization and these no-holds-barred battles between different ideologies, I think that will have a very fundamental impact on the kind of democracy that we have. So then the question arises, if we have these mega trends that are shaping our institutions, what are we supposed to do about it? Or how do we determine which path will we go? Will we become, in this case, for example, more consensus-based, or will we become more exclusionary? Will we become more polarized, or will we be able to find voices for everyone involved? And this is where I think if you again go back to the book, The Narrow Corridor, and the authors put this very well, that as much as I have spoken about good institutional design here, and they also speak about institutional quality a lot more, there is no perfect institutional design. And even if you get a very good institutional design, it is going to corrode over time, as I will show in the next slide. So this checks and balances, this institutional design is not the way we get to good institutional quality. It is this constant process of society mobilizing, defending liberty, and setting constraints on power. This is a nice chart for those of you who haven't read the book, which I would highly recommend, but you can look at their hypothesis, or basically the simplification of their argument is their state, their society, and state and society have to be at a constant tussle and have to be somewhat balanced for it to do well. While they argue that India falls in this quadrant, which is the society is far more powerful than the state, I think that's where I disagree with them, where I believe this is a state where it wants to be powerful. I think the power of the state in India is probably a lot patchier, but where it wants to be powerful lies in this side of the narrow corridor. And therefore it boils down to individuals, to citizens, to hold these kind of institutional quality in place. And that's where I start kind of almost attacking my own argument, which is to say that as much as we talk about institutional quality, formal institutions exist in a certain culture. And it's that culture of that country which will determine what it results in. What I mean by that, for example, a very real example is we're now having these discussions on marriage equality. And marriage equality, if you look at how it came about in the US, well, the first few wins were all legal wins, where in certain state courts, etc., they won the right to marriage equality. Those very quickly rolled back because the popular consensus was not where the legal wins were. And therefore, a coalition of kind of non-profits and activists, etc., came together to make that transition in popular consciousness. They ran ad campaigns, they kind of spoke to neighbors, so it became a full-fledged political, or social mobilization. Some of the most powerful things that they did, for example, was to have grandparents of LGBTQ people come and talk in ads about how that's the kind of life that they wish for their grandchildren. I'm thinking it's only when now that more than the majority of American citizens support same-sex marriage, support marriage equality, etc., that those wins now seem permanent, though of course with this kind of Supreme Court setup there, one might look back at it and find things would be different. And I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, but basically the argument I make here is this is a constant battle that has to be continuously fought, because every time you're going to see there's going to be this tendency towards erosion. Reversing erosion is extremely difficult. You see that, for example, with the predecessor of the NSA in the US, where brought in as a World War I wartime measure saying this is an emergency, we need to be able to surveil our citizens. It was rolled back in 1929 when the Secretary of State at that point said, gentlemen, do not read each other's mail. But again, during World War II, brought back, has then become this monstrosity as we know today. Lots of institutional gaps. It's a secret court. Nobody knows how judges are appointed. Only hears arguments from one side, etc. But despite all of that, at least they have to put hundreds of pages of documentation together before every wiretap is approved, which is us safeguards we don't have in India. And finally, this is the final chapter that I end up with, which is especially for young people, probably not in this room, but young people who are friends, etc., Gen Z millennials who we interact with, a lot of thinking might be that, who am I to work on these bigger topics? These are things that I don't either have time for, the risk appetite for, etc. And therefore lay out different ways in which people can actually contribute to the process. First and foremost is public opinion. A classic example of this is the Model Code of Conduct for elections. Even though it has what one might argue somewhat questionable legal basis and enforceability, but at the same time, it is something that really shapes the discourse around elections. There is certain moral weight to the Model Code of Conduct, which at least puts some guardrails, if not very effective ones, around the elections. And in fact, one of the chief economic advisors, chief election commissioners I spoke to called it the Moral Code of Conduct. Similarly, there's capital mobility. All of us vote with our feet. And I think that is a big thing that governments now keep in mind to at least protect some kind of institutional quality. Most often, obviously, seen in economic areas where some of the power reforms that were, one might say, almost enforced on India happened because of this fear of capital mobility. Finally, the hard guardrails, which are on mass mobilization, classic example being the Right to Information Act. So I trace in the book a little bit about the history of the right to information, what can we think about it. And a lot of people think that mass mobilization and institutional quality are different, and mass mobilization typically talks about popular issues, institutional quality is typically an esoteric issue, but I don't think that's true. Obviously the RTI being a classic example, but even if you look at the farmers' protest that happened recently, one of their demands was that this fertilizer subsidy should be, the MSP should be enshrined in law, which if you think of it is an institutional aspect. So I think institutions widely defined are also often part of these kind of mass mobilizations. And finally, litigation, which all of us are familiar with, probably the most popular way of improving quality of institutions in India. But out there as well, public opinion has a very strong role to play, because otherwise people would say, look, I'm not the one who's fighting this in court, why do I care about this? But data and research from the US shows that every time the social or the popular opinion on a topic changes, we see court opinions change as well. So there's a strong correlation between where courts land up on a particular topic and what the popular mood on consensus in the country on that topic is. And even in India, we see courts often make a reference to kind of the consciousness of the citizens, the consciousness of the society, etc. So a role to play for individuals even from that perspective. All of that to say, therefore, and this is what I will wrap up with, that the journey I kind of try to take you down is that we need to talk a lot more about institutions. I think most of our popular discourse is about people, about personalities, etc. Personalities come and go, institutions, processes stay much longer. Second, India has a set of recurrent themes across its public institutions, which is a function of how we were born and therefore the choices that our founders made. The third point is that this is going to change. There are these mega trends that are at play here, and the direction in which it goes is going to be based on our ability as citizens to actually walk the path on each of these 4 channels of institutional change. So with that, thank you for being patient for almost 40 minutes. Really appreciate you taking out the time and would love to hear perspectives. As I said, as popular nonfiction, this makes many leaps of faith, but hopefully somewhat of a useful framework to start thinking about it. Obviously, the way the presentation is done probably makes it sound a little bit more arcane and dry, but I would encourage you to read the book where this is put forth in a far more accessible and readable and interesting way.
When you were talking about mass mobilization, I remembered Israel and the priceless one-liner by Bhargavi. Sometimes the courts protect the people and sometimes the people protect the courts.
I think, Ajay, in addition to that, I was thinking about this earlier today, which is when do we see mobilization around some of these topics? Because again, these might sound like esoteric topics, and why don't we see enough mobilization? Why do people not come up on streets here to protect independence of the court, for example? And I thought a couple of things, right? One is institutional erosion often is not a sudden process, it's through several small cuts, and therefore each of those cuts doesn't seem consequential enough, which is why people don't show up. Secondly, one of the things that Yamini and I had spoken about was this disillusionment of the middle class or the privileged people to participate in the messy negotiations of politics. And I think a third one is just kind of status quoist, chalta hai, kuch nahi kar sakte type of attitude. But hopefully with Israel showing the way, there might be more of these things that we might see.
Okay, I have two things. One is, you made a remark somewhere along the line and said that what we are today is the consequence of the cultural impact on us. Right? Now, if you go back in history, India was never a democratic country. So democracy is some kind of a craft on us. Has it therefore taken sufficient roots for us to be able to say with certain amount of pride and say we are really truly democratic? That is one issue. The other is about your mass mobilization. Everybody is hurt by corruption. I can't even get a death certificate without, forget birth certificate, obviously not. Even a death certificate I can't get. I can't get an insurance doctor to certify that I'm really sick and I'm entitled to insurance policy. So why is it that there is no mass mobilization? You and I talk about it. We are hurt every day where you want, in fact, that is the reason why I don't own property. Because I refuse to pay even one paisa as a corruption bribe to anybody, whether it is the chief secretary of the state or the man who passes your plans at the planning authority level. So how come that there is no mass mobilization?
A bit more negatively on this point, I don't want to take away from the fact that as much as we talk about public participation, etc., sometimes some of these values will be an imposition from the elites. And I think in Amit's podcast in particular, I think several guests have referred to that. Right? You might argue that democracy itself was an imposition of the elites and their value systems, etc. To the question of whether it has taken deep enough roots, I think all of us will have divergent answers. There are certain aspects of which we've done fairly well, which is in terms of being an electoral democracy. We've probably done.
Election is the index, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. As an electoral democracy, and again, I mean, given our neighborhood, I don't think it's a small achievement. But in terms of being a true participative democracy, have we come even close? We don't have the structures and processes around that. Right? Even if you look at, for example, public consultations, which is a hallmark of any democratic process, even the best of our regulators, which would be TRAI and the airport's economic authority, only do like public consultation 40-50%. SEBI drops down to 10%, RBI drops down to 2%. Then there was and that is very often, that's literally the job that regulators are trying to do in terms of public consultation. If you look at Parliament, consultations are even, despite the policy in 2015, far lower. So I think some aspects of democracies have certainly taken root. There's at least lip service paid to them in a very strong, vehement way. But in terms of the non-electoral aspects of democracy, we probably lack quite a bit. The second thing, which is to part of your question, why are people not mobilizing on corruption, etc., I think extremely complex question, to which I certainly don't have the answers. But some of the hypotheses that I do take is, at some level, there is, which I was mentioning, that some of these institutional erosions are far more long-term. Like if I am a person who's always lived in this corrupt environment, I don't even know what the alternative is. So what am I even protesting for? I believe this is fact of life, that I will live my life this way. Then the second is that the middle class, as we would define it, can in some ways insulate itself from the rest of the society. I do not worry so much about the police because at some level I know that at some point I could possibly pay a bribe and get out of it. The people who are actually affected most by that kind of tyranny are people who don't have as much of a voice in the system. So I think the fact that people who have voice, have privilege, etc., don't have incentive, and in some ways one might even argue are beneficiaries of this kind of a broken system. They don't have the incentive then to participate in this political protest or political mobilization. But that said, again, one of the things that I do truly believe is that, and when I entered public policy, my boss at that point had mentioned this. Unfortunately, the truth of public policy is if you're not in the circles, if you're not in government, you keep trying to improve things, and most of the time nothing will happen. You just stay there to be at the right moment at the right time. And I do believe maybe, obviously, the Lopal movement hasn't even come close to achieving its promise and aspirations, but has moved the needle a little bit for some people to then pick up the baton and do that in future. So I know I'm getting a little abstract and philosophical at this point, but at least the way I would think of it is it's a continuous process.
Yeah, I have two questions. So one is you started with the original sins, right? So you said the weakened fundamental rights. It was as opposed to US. We did not think of it as a check on state. I am not sure why you are saying that, because I believe that is something that has stood as a guardrail even now. Your liberty without due process, your self-incrimination. So those are in fact what is standing now as a check over the administrative action of the state. That was one thing I wanted to input on. Second, yeah, mass mobilization, probably the laws, for instance, your privacy law, right? So when you speak to the mass, more people are probably worried about Google taking your data than government taking your data, right? In fact, Google is doing you a favor by taking your data. At least it's giving you targeted information, advertisement, whatever. So it is kind of aligned to what the mass needs, but does the mass know what it needs?
Got it. So I'll answer both your questions. Of course, not taking away from the credibility of the fundamental rights at all, right? But I do think that it is worth reflecting on that these are weakened forms of it. Even if you look at, again, I don't want to overdo this contrast with the US, but whereas in the US the First Amendment was to strengthen your right to speech, in India it was to weaken your right to speech, right? Which was, then you bring in all these other exceptions. So I'm not saying those have not been useful. In fact, they've been incredibly useful, but they have they're of a form that's far weaker than one would. Many would argue they would have preferred. The second thing, however, is a lot of those strengthening of the fundamental rights has been led by courts interpreting it in a certain way, and therefore we have the system of where at some point it's almost like cyclical. At some points fundamental rights become more important in jurisprudence, etc., where courts take a more activist stand, and then we leave ourselves vulnerable at the time of downturns where courts then give up kind of their duty to protect citizens. So it's been because of the way that they've been drafted, because of the way they've been amended, etc. I think it leaves a lot of interpretative powers to governments, which I think as a society we need to reflect on. So I forgot the second part of your question.
It was about privacy and mass. That was not a question.
Yeah. So look, I do think that how do you make part of the reason I wrote the book was to try to make some of these topics more accessible to people who are not usually engaged on this topic. That's why the book is written in the way that it is written. But therefore, I do think it is obligatory about some of the people who I might call intermediaries. And as think tanks, you have, for example, knowledge intermediaries of a particular kind, to make that conversation more accessible to people. Which is to say that, again, in the US, for example, the civil society on the marriage equality case got together, run lots of A/B tests on ads to see which are the ones that are resonating more with people, and then devoted resources to all of that. For example, and again, I'm not blaming civil society. There's a reason that they are not able to do all this. But theoretically, if you kind of go and test out what are the messages around government surveillance that resonate with people? How do you build more of a community around that, reaching out across different mediums? For example, I thought Internet Freedom Foundation's done a good thing with their Instagram page, right, which is trying to make a lot of this a lot more accessible. So I think there are those models, but there's a certain reinvention required of the way that we talk about these issues to really build more of a mass mobilization or even public opinion around that. Otherwise, if we just constantly take the last route, which is around litigation, etc., there are limitations to how far that can go.
Sort of deeper question there is that part of the reason for this apathy I've come to realize is that in modern times with technology, more and more people are actually able to live despite the state. So your institutions may be weak, you might have a state that is completely dysfunctional, but where we should, I think, be concerned about the state is in acts of commission, where it carries out acts of tyranny. But acts of omission are, I think, getting less and less of a problem because people are more and more learning to live despite the state, and technology and markets have empowered more and more of us. And obviously, it's much more visible in the elites, and a lot of the country doesn't have that. But it's so. What do you kind of feel about that? Because my other observation is that what you talk about institutional erosion being reversed, I can't think of concrete examples where that's really happened meaningfully. When when we speak of state power being reduced and that going in a backward direction, I can't, even under Reagan, the US government grew massively, right? There's nothing you can do about this hungry leviathan, but technology and markets could be a hope at an individual level, perhaps. So,
Right. So, to the first point you make, and that's absolutely true, which is, and this is what Arundhati Roy said, that stop worrying about people who are talking about the separation of Kashmir, talk about the people in Gurgaon who are separating into their own colonies, which is completely independent of the government and context around them. And that is absolutely part of this, which is, again, our lives are just way too insulated. Even as I live in Bangalore, for example, I'm surprised by how many power cuts there are in Koramangala, but I also don't care because I have power backup. And therefore, my willingness to raise voice for local issues just goes down a lot. The second thing is, I think, also popular narratives around some of this, and which is what Arun Subramanian spoke about demonetization, where people were hurt, but because they believed that someone who they didn't like was hurt more, they put up with it. So similarly, while people might be inconvenienced by whatever policies of the government, as long as I believe that someone else is inconvenienced more and I don't like that person, I will be willing to live with it. So narratives and how, and this is again a good book, which is The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities. How do you create these narratives and propagate these narratives in a way that protects those in power becomes fairly important. In terms of mass mobilization, again, and this is something I don't have been able to communicate very effectively, but which is to say that, look, because institutions are so pervasive in every aspect of our life, there are so many, like there are millions of permutations and combinations of things that need to improve. And any improvement, so there are two aspects. One is halting the decline or lowering the pace of decline, because if you believe decline is inevitable, the least we can do is to try to prevent it or reduce it as much as we can. And where, for example, one might believe that the path Israel went down with its judiciary was in some ways inevitable, but you kind of turn up in the street and try to reverse it. But the second is that I do think there have been significant cases where things have improved by a little margin, right? Which is RTI, for example, is the example in India. Though of course, when pressed hard, one would believe where's the second RTI movement that we've had. But again, smaller things like if you talk about public opinion, the Save the Internet movement, you might believe it's somewhat esoteric, somewhat very specific, but whatever it be, it did kind of push back against a certain.
Take, for example, Chitko. Chitko was a great mass movement.
Correct. So I do think when you think about institutions, I don't think we are getting the big bang wins, or not very easily, and we don't. If we go down that path, I don't know, there might be unintended consequences, but the whole point is that in every day that we kind of live, we kind of try to improve things a little bit. But I completely agree. If you think of like these really large consequential movements, apart from an RTI, it's difficult to think of a second RTI movement.
I have 3-4 unconnected observations.
Okay, I will try to note them so I don't forget them.
See, one is while there is a flow that you have to your book. See, I think we are a large country with a lot of people and a lot of poor people and people who cannot vote. So in such a situation, this whole concept of, or rather this thing about democracy, as sir also pointed out, I don't know how far it takes us. B, we don't have a model. See, like the way you give an example of US and others. See, US has one very basic model. Companies have to win, businesses have to work. Businesses win, people benefit. We don't have a model. And US made a model and they made it work. We neither have a model, nor do we therefore know how to make it work. So that's the second point, that unless or until we have a model which works for us, the US model doesn't work for us, the China model doesn't. We need a model for ourselves where you have 1.4 billion people, poor people who are not bothered whether it's corruption or no corruption. It doesn't matter to most people on the street. You and I can talk about it, but they're not. So I think so institutions come if there is a model. The US has institutions which support their model, that there is a capitalist, there is the intelligentsia, there is a politician. None of them is powerful enough to do anything, but three of them together can somewhat meander and make it work for them. So that's my line of thinking, that A, we are poor people, B, we don't have a model, and therefore whatever we do, it doesn't go anywhere.
And I think that's an absolutely important point. It also goes to one of the leaps of faith in the arguments that I make in the book, which is while I've tried to show it as relatively context independent principles of good institutions, but obviously context matters a lot in all of these ways. But one of the hypotheses and assertions I make is that across everything that's broken, irrespective of what model you choose, there are certain things that you would, like if you want to create, whether you choose a socialist model, a capitalist model, whatever else, you want to have any use of government monopoly of violence to have transparency and independent oversight, etc. So at least the way I think of it is that probably in terms of improving public institutions in India, 80%, and this is just a random number, but perhaps 80% or a large part of it can be accounted for by just doing these basic things right, which seem like basic things, which is write a good law, have transparency, have independent oversight, etc. And then there's going to be that little bit which is going, or some parts of it which is going to be very context dependent based on the model that you adopt, both socially, economically, or anything else. So the idea here was, can we think of principles that will be applicable whether we choose to be a different kind of country, etc. Because so I don't go into what should be the kind of country that we should, but more like whatever we choose to be the kind of country that we are, what are the processes and structures that we should follow.
Continuing on the idea of models, I have a little story, and let's think further on where this takes us. There was an early draft of the of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, inside which there is a brand new regulator, the IBBI. Okay, so the drafting team was very clever, and they were at the frontiers of Indian thinking, and there were 140 sections pulled out of the Indian Financial Code on the working of a regulator, okay, saying that this is our state of the art. We know how a regulator has to work. It has to have this kind of board, the role and function and composition of the board, legislative process, executive process, judicial process, reporting, accountability, all that. When it got to the legislative division, strangely enough, they got an instruction that the bankruptcy law has to be 300 sections. Somehow, somebody decided that the law has to be 300 sections. So a whole bunch of sections had to be deleted. And the easiest solution for the drafting expertise in legislative division, basically the lawyers in legislative division, the easiest way for them was to delete all the nice sections of putting up a regulator and cut and pasting the provisions from the SEBI Act. And so you got one more normal Indian law with what in the eyes of lawyers at the legislative division was the model regulator, namely SEBI. So that's how models matter, that you need to understand this thing. You need to have an aspiration that, no, we can do better. Because in a normal, unintellectual practitioner setting, these ideas are missing. And then they just take whatever is commonplace. So SEBI is commonplace. So yeah, let's cut and paste from the SEBI Act.
Known route. They know it. They don't know how well it has worked, but they know it has been implemented. Than taking a new path.
Path dependency. you have something to turn to, something to copy paste from, or one might argue shared laziness.
And also, this is our project of persuasion that there are very large numbers of people in the country who aren't thinking about this stuff, who aren't reading, who aren't cogitating, and the burden is on us to persuade people that look, this thing ain't working, and merely replicating the SEBI law to more organizations will reproduce the failures of SEBI.
Absolutely.
A Japanese scholar wrote a paper and said, why do we need so many articles in the Indian Constitution? Just have Article 14 and 21, you can do exactly what the Supreme Court has done.
Excellent. Any other perspectives?
I'm just thinking aloud and wondering, there's that famous saying that paradigms change one funeral at a time, and that applies obviously to individuals. So I'm just wondering that if, for paradigms at the grand level of states and societies to change, nation states have to die, and you actually need a revolution. You're not going to have change in the margin. Like you have the great violence of the birth of America, and then you have a set of values, and they persist for 300 years. Or you have independence in partition, and then you have a constitution which is clearly out of sync with society, and doesn't, by the way, have anywhere near the kind of fundamental rights it should in practice, and yet it persists and it kind of dominates. So short of something revolutionary, how do you, do you have great hope? I mean, I don't know if there's much hope for change. You'll have little marginal things here and there, and even the mass mobilizations that you see often go in the wrong directions. Like the farm laws being struck down is deeply problematic and a backward move and makes future reform difficult. Similarly, even with the Lokpal bill, you were just making the state bigger and more unaccountable, in my view, rather than the other way around.
So, 2-3 ways that I think about that problem. So, firstly, I can't say anything about wholesale revolution because, again, cameras on, sedition laws are there, so can't say much. But that said, at least what gives me hope is, what we often forget is obviously the UK, US, liberal democracies, right? Centuries and centuries of working on what they know and what they do and trying to do things a little better. And they've taken obviously a lot of their own backward steps, etc., to get there. We're still in that sense a relatively young country. So hopefully, I share your sense of pessimism, but I think we have as human beings no option but to try to be a little optimistic. And
pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Okay, thanks a lot for joining us today, everyone. Thank you, Subhashish. When I joined the organization, the one thing my senior told me was, don't get into it expecting that you're going to change the world tomorrow. It's about small incremental changes. So I think that's one of the key takeaways from the book that I got today. And yeah, please do buy the book and read it.
Thank you.